We have been on hiatus through the summer and through the high holidays and through most of Hanukkah. There's a few hours left to go. But we are pleased to be back with our first speaker of the relaunched Lunch and Learn, Brad Kolodny. Brad has photographed more than 600 synagogues in 13 countries over the last 30 plus years. His talk today is based on his book, Seeking Sanctuary, 125 Years of Synagogues on Long Island, and also on an exhibit of his work at the Suffolk County Historical Society Museum in Riverhead. In addition to his writing and his photography, Brad is president of the Jewish Historical Society of Long Island, and we are very pleased to welcome him here today. I would ask all of you to please mute yourselves so that we don't get any distractions in the background. And now I will turn the program over to Brad. At the conclusion of the program, you can unmute, or Brad had said that he might ask you to unmute throughout the program if he has some questions that he'd like to ask and maybe get some feedback from you. So you will listen to him and follow his instructions. But in the meantime, I ask you to please mute for now. And Brad, thank you for joining us today, and carry on.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be with you all. I understand that the Lunch and Learn is a great program at your synagogue and it's been on hold, and I'm certainly honored to be play a small part in bringing it back. As Sarah mentioned, if everybody can be on mute, that would be fantastic. But there will be times during the presentation where I will ask some questions and for some feedback, perhaps even some trivia, if you will. And it's just meant to liven things up, make it a little bit more interactive than just me talking. And I hope everybody has their lunch ready and they are ready to learn. So Sarah, as Sarah mentioned, I have written a book, as you can see on the screen right now, Seeking Sanctuary, 125 Years of Synagogues on Long Island. And I certainly did not set out to write a book. The idea came to me way back in 2015, when my synagogue, Midway Jewish Center in Syosset, was undergoing a renovation of the sanctuary. And, I had done a lot of history projects for the synagogue. I had, put together a history display inside the building itself. And so I've always been interested in video and photography and history projects. And so the night before the demolition was in March of 2015. I was inside of Midway, inside the sanctuary, taking photographs to remember the way the building was at that moment, which 24 hours later would never be the same again. And I remember thinking to myself that night, what happens when a sacred space is taken down to the wall studs and the floorboards? What memories are lost of the way things used to be? My own children had, my daughter had her bat mitzvah, my son had his bar mitzvah in that sanctuary, and we had been active members, as we still are, at Midway. And, I just started to think about everything that was going to be lost. And then I began to think about it in a larger context. What memories have already been lost? Not just at Midway, but at other synagogues in the area that are undergoing similar projects. And also what memories are lost due to the fact that there are so many synagogues. As we all know, the unfortunate reality, there are synagogues that are closing. Who is going to remember those synagogues and the Jewish life that existed in that community? So I remember asking myself two specific questions that night when I was at Midway. Number one, what's the oldest synagogue on Long Island? When was it built? Where was it located? I had no idea. The other question I asked myself was, how many synagogues are there on Long Island? Long Island, as many of you may know, It's a very heavily Jewish populated area. It is actually the fourth largest Jewish community in the United States after New York City, Los Angeles, and Southern Florida. And so I wanted to know and discover how many synagogues there were across Long Island. So I started out doing some research and taking some photos of synagogues just in my area, put them up on an Instagram account that's called Synagogues of Long Island. And I started posting different synagogue buildings and a little bit of the history. And I'll share some of the photos that I have taken. Incidentally, you'll see about 60 photos in this presentation, and in the book, there are about 350. So these are a few, just a representative sample of a few different synagogues. On the upper left, you have the old Westbury Hebrew congregation, a very modern building. The upper right is Congregation Beth Shalom in Lawrence, an Orthodox congregation, sort of in the Greek Revival architecture style. The lower left is a Sephardic synagogue in Long Beach, and the lower right is a Reconstructionist synagogue in Cold Spring Harbor. And you know, these photographs I think are very representative of what I found so amazing about photographing synagogues from Great Neck to Montauk is the diversity. And not just the diversity in the religious observance, but in the diversity of the synagogue architecture, you know, the buildings themselves. And I knew that if I was going to write something that was completely comprehensive about Jewish life on Long Island and about synagogues on Long Island, I would also not just have to take pictures on the outside, but I would have to take pictures on the inside. And so in the upper left, you see a very large sanctuary at Temple Israel in Lawrence. The upper right is the Chabad of Melville. As many of you may know, the Chabad locations around Long Island, around the world really, mostly start out in the home of a rabbi. And so the sanctuary in that home is quite small. The lower left is the Dix Hills Jewish Center. And what I love about this sanctuary is the natural light that comes in from the skylight above. And the lower right is a synagogue on Fire Island. I'm not sure how many of you realize that there is a synagogue on Fire Island. The fact of the matter is there are two synagogues on Fire Island. This synagogue is the original. One of its founders, incidentally, was Herman Wouk, the author. He used to hold services on the porch of his home in Fire Island, and then this synagogue was built in 1972. In 1995, the congregation voted. It was a traditional congregation, and they voted to become egalitarian. And so what happens at that point? The more traditional members decide to leave, and they form their own congregation. So you actually have two synagogues on Fire Island. There's a lot that you can tell about the history of a synagogue based on being on the inside. And you can see this ark on the left, magnificent hand-carved wooden ark that is from 1900. It is installed at Temple Chaverim in Plainview, which actually didn't start until 1999. So the history of this ark goes back to Jamaica, Queens. It was installed in a building, in a synagogue in Jamaica, Queens, from 1900 until 1980, when the synagogue ceased to exist. The ark went into storage, and somehow they found out about the leadership of Temple Chaverim found out about it, and they were able to resurrect it, and it lives on and is a magnificent, magnificent ark. Very traditional, obviously. On the right, you have a much more modern interpretation of an ark. This is at the Cherry Lane Minyan in Kings Point, just north of Great Neck. And you can see the Torahs in the ark, as well as above the ark, the glass and steel and modern interpretation of a Star of David. There's also a lot of history locally within specific synagogues that you can tell by their ark. The ark on the left comes out of Congregation Beth Israel in Hempstead. That synagogue began in 1915 So it's one of the oldest, not as old as your congregation, of course. But nevertheless, they started in 1915. Their synagogue opened in 1920, and this was the ark that was installed in that building. In 1950, post-World War II, they were seeing significant growth. They had a second synagogue that was built on Fulton Avenue. They took the ark out of the original building, put it into the second building. Fast forward 30 years, 1980, the Jewish community of Hempstead was not growing at the same pace, and so the congregation decided to downsize. They're in a smaller facility now on Hilton Avenue in Hempstead, and this ark again has made its way into the current building. So same ark, 3 different buildings. The upper right photo is the Bethpage Jewish Community Center. This is a synagogue that merged with my synagogue, Midway, in 2007. And you can see the 12 stained glass windows on both sides of the ark, on the left-hand side here, on the right-hand side here. And those windows were taken out of the sanctuary at Bethpage before the building was sold. And as part of the consolidation of the 2 synagogues, these stained glass windows were installed at Midway, and it's a beautiful reminder of that community. The photograph on the lower right was taken. I took this photograph at Congregation Beth El in Massapequa. They had merged with a synagogue in Lindenhurst, and the synagogue in Lindenhurst brought over these glass doors that you see on the ark. The unfortunate reality is that Congregation Beth El has merged with another congregation nearby. That would be Congregation Beth Or in Belmore. And they again have moved these glass doors into that sanctuary. And so one of these days I'll have to visit that synagogue and get a new picture and update the presentation with the way the glass doors look in their new home. So in terms of history on Long Island, a lot of people wonder, well, when did the Jews first arrive? And there were a handful maybe before the Revolutionary War and through the colonial period. But immigration is really the story, with Jews coming from Eastern Europe to the United States and then following New York City and then migrating out to Long Island. The first community established on Long Island, the first synagogue, or congregation, I should say, the first congregation established on Long Island was in the town of Breslau, and it was called Netta Sarche. Netta Sarche means planting of the seed. And this congregation never built a synagogue itself, but they did purchase land in the Breslau cemetery. And so that cemetery is still used today, and it is the oldest existing Jewish cemetery on Long Island. Now, let's see, we have 23 people on this call, and I believe you're all Long Islanders. I would imagine some of you might have a question right now. Where is Breslau? I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with Breslau. In 1891, the name Breslau was renamed to its current name. Does anybody know? Does anybody want to take themselves off of mute and then remute and guess where the town of Breslau is on Long Island? No brave souls want to take a guess? All right, well, I'll give you this one, but I'm going to expect some more participation a little bit later on.
Brentwood? I don't know.
Brentwood is a good guess. I'm glad you guessed. Thank you.
Okay.
It's not correct. It is in
Okay.
Suffolk County. It's a little
Okay.
bit further south. The town of
Middle
Breslau was
Island?
renamed
Islip.
Islip. Another good
Middle-
guess.
Middle Island.
Middle Island. Thank you. Another good guess. Anyone else?
Oakdale.
Oakdale.
Babylon.
Babylon. We're getting
Freeport.
a lot of good guesses, but we're not there yet. It's
East
close to
Hampton.
Babylon.
East Hampton.
No, not East Hampton.
Cedarhurst.
Lindenhurst. Somebody said.
Riverhead.
Lindenhurst is correct.
Baldwin, Freeport.
Lindenhurst.
Lindenhurst. Lindenhurst is correct. So
Okay.
in 1891, the town of Breslau became the town of Lindenhurst, and that is where the first congregation of Jews on Long Island was formed. A lot of people guess Sag Harbor, but Sag Harbor is not the right answer, and I'll explain that in a second. So we know the first congregation was established in Lindenhurst, but they never built a synagogue. Does anyone want to take a guess where the first synagogue was built on Long Island?
I thought it was here.
So Greenport was not the first. Greenport was actually the third in 1903.
Sag Harbor?
Sag Harbor is the second. That is a very good guess, a very common guess. Sag Harbor is not the first synagogue built on Long Island. Anybody want to take a guess in what town the first synagogue on Long Island was built? It is also in Suffolk County, and it is not one of the towns that you've already guessed.
Huntington.
Huntington is an excellent guess. Early congregation formed in 1907. This particular synagogue was built in 1896. In
Patchogue?
what town?
Patchogue?
Another good guess. A very early synagogue there was built in Patchogue, I think it was 1906. The first synagogue on Long Island was built in
Smithtown.
Setauket, not Smithtown.
Setauket.
Setauket. I was just going to, yeah, Setauket.
So Setauket is very surprising to a lot of people. Why Setauket? How is it that there were enough Jews in Setauket to build a synagogue? So the story is that in the 1880s, there was a rubber factory in Setauket that needed manual labor, and they got their labor force hiring immigrants, not just Jewish immigrants, but also Irish and Italian. But the significance is that, they say that by about 1900, there were about 25% of the factory workers were Jewish.
Somebody isn't muted and we're hearing their noise and your voice has gone down.
Yeah, if everybody can mute, just a reminder. Thank you. So the rubber factory in Setauket was the largest employer in Suffolk County in 1895. So just to give you a sense of how many Jews were living in Setauket at the time. In 1893, the Jews of Setauket come together to form a congregation called Agudas Achim, and 3 years later, they built this synagogue in Setauket in 1896. The building still stands. We just celebrated the 125th anniversary of this building back in September, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it's just a really interesting fact. It's no longer being used as a synagogue because of a number of different factors, and I'll just give you the real quick story. In 2 years after the synagogue was built, there was a fire at the rubber factory. And a lot of the Jews and a lot of the workers in the factory lost their jobs, and so they had to move out of town. In 1904, there was a second fire of dubious origin at the rubber factory, and that essentially closed the rubber factory for good. There were merchants that still lived in town, and there was a butcher who was still in town. But the fact is that by World War I, this congregation had ceased to exist. The building was locked up and nobody used it for 30 years until 1948, post-World War II, when you had new Jews moving to the area, and a congregation that you might be familiar with called North Shore Jewish Center formed in 1948, and they utilized this building as their synagogue. In 1971, they built their current home, which is in Port Jeff Station, and they sold this building to the United Methodist Church in Setauket, and it is being used today as a thrift store. So somebody guessed Sag Harbor as the oldest synagogue on Long Island. It is the second oldest, but it has a distinction of being the oldest continuously used synagogue building on Long Island. It was built in 1900, and it is still in use today. Living pretty close to the area, some of you may know that the synagogue is under construction. They have maintained the original sanctuary, but everything around it has been torn down, and they are building a new building, a lower level, an upper level, and that's due to be completed, I think, by Rosh Hashanah of next year. Not entirely sure. So sorry that I keep flipping back and forth a little bit. Everything that we've talked about up until this point, Lindenhurst, Setauket, Sag Harbor, they're all in Suffolk County. Does anyone want to take a guess? If you want to take yourself off mute for a second, where was the first congregation formed in Nassau County?
Great Neck.
Great Neck is a very good guess, very close to Queens and very western Nassau County. The first synagogue wasn't built, or the first congregation wasn't established there until the 1920s. This congregation formed in 1897. Anybody else want to take a guess? What town?
Report?
Freeport, another good guess.
Manhasset.
Manhasset, that's a pretty good guess.
Lawrence?
Lawrence, down the South Shore. This synagogue or this congregation was actually very much on the North Shore. To give you a little bit of a hint.
Huntington.
Huntington's in Suffolk County. So I will tell you that.
What about Glen Cove?
Rabbi, you are correct. Glen Cove, in fact, is the synagogue or the first congregation formed in Nassau County, the same name as your synagogue, Congregation Tifereth Israel. They utilized this opera house in 1899 for Yom Kippur services. And they later purchased the opera house using it for their synagogue. In the 1920s, they tore the opera house down, built a new synagogue there. And then in the 1960s, post-World War II, they built another building, which is their current building on Landing Road. Now, because they used the opera house, they didn't actually build a synagogue until the 1920s. There was a synagogue built in Nassau County before that. Who knows, or who wants to take a guess? The location of the first synagogue built in Nassau County. What town?
Roslyn?
Sorry, say again.
Roslyn?
Roslyn, good guess. I don't believe anyone has mentioned this town yet.
Oceanside?
Oceanside is a good guess. It is
It's a bit
not Mark.
on North.
Long Beach.
Long Beach. No, this is closer to Oceanside.
Lynbrook.
Oh, wait a second.
Five towns?
I think someone was about to say it.
Rockville Center?
Yes. Rockville Center is correct. The first synagogue built in Nassau County was for a congregation known as B'nai Shalom. It opened in 1915, and you can see from this photograph of a painting that there was a trolley track that ran alongside the synagogue. The synagogue was located on Windsor Avenue. And I'm not sure, the congregation may very well have picked this location because of the trolley. The trolley ran from Brooklyn all the way to Freeport, which obviously would have made it much easier to get to the synagogue. It was built in 1915. The congregation still exists today. As I've mentioned many times already, and you're, I'm sure, seeing a consistent theme, post-World War II, the congregation is growing, and they built a second home on Hempstead Avenue in Rockville Center that they still use today. And this building was torn down in the 1950s. So for me, this was really interesting to find this painting because I had a very difficult time finding a photograph of this building. The painting was hanging on the wall in the synagogue office. And so I felt really fortunate to be able to find it and to photograph it. But once I started thinking about a book, this really opened my eyes to a whole another group of synagogue buildings that I had to record, which are buildings that once stood, but are no longer. And so there are several examples. In the upper left-hand corner, you have the Kings Park Jewish Center. This was built in 1908, but was torn down after a fire in 1962. In the upper right-hand corner, this is the Lindenhurst Hebrew Congregation. They built 3 synagogues. The first in 1915. This second one was in the 1930s, and the third one was in 1959. The lower left photograph is the Israel Community Center in Levittown. Levittown, as you may know, was the first suburban community established really in the United States. And the Levitt family that built the town also deeded property for a religious institution to build, and the synagogue was built in 1948. In the lower right, you have a really interesting building, an interesting group called the Society for Jewish Science. And the Society for Jewish Science was established in the 1920s in Manhattan. That was a response to Christian Science, which had been very popular in that era. The Society for Jewish Science built this synagogue in 1955, and it was torn down in 1975, becoming housing developments. So beyond synagogues that no longer exist, you also have synagogue buildings that were constructed for use as a synagogue. The building still stands, but it's no longer used as a synagogue. So a couple of examples here. In the upper left, you have the former Uniondale Jewish Center, which is now the town of Hempstead's Housing Authority office. In the upper right-hand corner, you see the New Hyde Park Jewish Community Center. It is now a Vaishnav temple, which is a form of Hinduism, but you can see here that there are still remnants that there was once a synagogue, and you could see the Star of David actually on both doors. You could see the Star of David outline. The lower left, this is my favorite building from the outside, my favorite synagogue from the exterior, for a couple of reasons. First off, it is the only example of Moorish revival architecture on Long Island. You can see the two towers with the onion domes at the top, and at one time there were Stars of David on both onion domes, but one has fallen off. The other thing that I really like about it is when you look at it straight on, to me, it gives the feeling or it gives the illusion of an open Torah. And the last photograph, the lower right hand, is it's a building called the Quonset Hut. And if you were driving by this building on Woodfield Road in West Hempstead, you might think that this was an old army barracks left over from World War II, or maybe it's an indoor tennis court or something like that. The fact of the matter is, this was built in this style as a synagogue for the Nassau Community Temple in 1949. It was a very inexpensive design, and the congregation only stayed there for 10 years before building another synagogue. The ownership of this building has changed hands many times since the 1960s. It was a beverage barn at one time. It was a deli at one time. And the sad reality is that today, this building is being used as a laundromat. So I'm going to switch gears for a second, maybe ask you a couple of more questions. Everybody knows who this guy is, Jerry Seinfeld. Jerry's family was from Brooklyn, but they moved out to Massapequa in the 1950s. And Jerry attended synagogue, and his family were members at Beth Shalom Center of Amityville and the Massapequas. So that was actually across the border from Nassau into Suffolk. Jerry had his bar mitzvah here in 1967. Does anybody want to take a guess who this boy is in the lower left-hand corner of the photo, right around his bar mitzvah year?
Billy Joel.
Very close, but not correct. It's not Billy Joel.
Billy Crystal.
It is Billy Crystal, correct.
That's Mary.
Billy Crystal was from Long Beach, and his family were members at Temple Emmanuel in Long Beach. And from what I understand, his brother is still a member of the synagogue there. How about this young lady? Anybody know who she is? She is a comedian and an actress.
Kathy Griffin.
Nope, not Kathy Griffin, although I do see the resemblance. That's a very good guess.
Sarah Schulman.
Somebody, I think before Sarah Schulman, I think somebody said it. It's Amy Schumer. Amy Schumer grew up in Rockville Center, and she had her bat mitzvah at Central Synagogue, which today is called Central Synagogue Beth Emet. Amy Schumer, in her biography, she credits her bat mitzvah as the moment when she decided that she wanted to be a comedian. And she just loved being in front of people, and it felt very comfortable for her. Does anybody know this older boy with the carnation in his lapel? It's a little bit of a giveaway because his name is actually on the board down here at the bottom. Andy Kaufman. You might remember him from the television show Taxi. He was also on Saturday Night Live. Andy Kaufman was from Great Neck, and his family were members of Temple Bethel in Great Neck. And the sad thing about Andy Kaufman is that he died at just 35, very, very young age. How about this guy? Anybody want to take a guess? Somebody, I think
Howard Stern.
Howard Stern.
Howard Stern, very good. That's usually one that many people get. Howard Stern was from Roosevelt, and he had his bar mitzvah at the Roosevelt Jewish Center. But Howard gets a little bit of extra credit because after he was married, he had 3 daughters. He raised his 3 daughters on Long Island, and they all had their bat mitzvah at Temple Sinai in Roslyn Heights. Now, Temple Beth Am in Merrick is a synagogue that's typical, post World War II. Does anybody know who Jerry Greenfield is? Jerry Greenfield had a partner in business whose name was Ben Cohen. You may not know them as Jerry and Ben.
Ben and Jerry.
You would know them as Ben and Jerry. That's right. Ben and Jerry, both from Merrick. They met in junior high school, and they both had their bar mitzvah at Temple Beth Am in Merrick. And there's one woman who is well known for doing something so significant that she got her picture on the front page of the New York Times. This was in 1955. And her name is Betty Robbins. Betty Robbins has the distinction of being the first female cantor, not just on Long Island, not just in the United States, but in the history of the Jewish people. The first hired female cantor, and she was hired to be the cantor at Temple Avoda in Oceanside. A very interesting little known fact.
What was the denomination of Temple Avoda?
Temple Avoda is a Reform congregation.
Reform.
Yeah, still is today.
I guess it had to be because the conservative movement at that point was still not egalitarian.
Correct. Yeah, this was 1955, so definitely not egalitarian yet. And there's some, more history. If we, you've all driven around and seen these historical markers. In the upper left, this is the Huntington Jewish Center's first synagogue building. It was built in 1913. The building still stands. You can see the historic marker on the left side. It is no longer being used as a synagogue. It is actually apartments. The interior has been subdivided into apartments. The lower photo is congregation B'nai Israel in Freeport. This synagogue was built in 1920. And again, post-World War II, synagogue was expanding. They built a second synagogue, and this first building still stands in Freeport, even though today it is a Greek Orthodox church. And I mentioned before the first synagogue ever built on Long Island in Suffolk, an effort that I was part of as president of the Jewish Historical Society of Long Island. We dedicated this historic marker in Suffolk just this past September. And what would the presentation be when you're talking about history without mentioning Tiferet Israel in Greenport? I love your synagogue. I've been there, and I think the inside is fantastic. I love the fact that you have the original sanctuary with the balcony and the stained glass windows, and I think it is an absolute gem. Definitely one of my favorites, and the fact that it's on the National Register of Historic Places makes it even that much more special in my eyes. There is one other building on Long Island that was once used as a synagogue that is also listed on the National Register of Historic Places, not because it was a synagogue, but because it was a firehouse. This is in Bayshore. In 1895, the Bayshore Fire Department constructed this building with a large interior because they wanted to house the fire truck inside the building. In 1919, there was a group called the United Brethren, the United Jewish Brethren in Bayshore, and they purchased this building to use as their synagogue. The building still exists today. The congregation ended up becoming the Jewish Center of Bayshore. They have their own synagogue on Clinton Avenue since 1950, and this building is an artist's studio today. So I want to talk a little bit about architecture. Before I started this project and this journey, I really didn't know anything much about architecture, but I certainly learned a lot. And there are a number of similarities based on certain periods that you can clearly identify. So I guess the earliest period of synagogue construction on Long Island, these are buildings that are representative of that style. You can see that in every case, each one of these synagogues is a rectangular shaped building with the narrow end of the rectangle facing the street. In every single case, you can see that there's an exterior staircase leading to the second floor of the building. And there was also a lower level. You could see a door here, and you can see a door here that led to a lower level. The upper level, incidentally, does Greenport have a lower level? I don't remember seeing that.
No, we have a basement, which is not used.
Basement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in most cases for synagogues of this era, even the basement would have been considered the lower level where, you might have had, Oneg Shabbat or classrooms for the children or offices, general meeting space downstairs. The upper level of all these buildings was used for the sanctuary and for nothing else. And it's interesting to take a look at the buildings of this era, including your building, and to understand that it is just somewhat of a plain architecture style. It's not fancy at all. In certain cases, in this building, you don't even see a Star of David or anything out front that shows that it is a Jewish house of worship. And that was by design. And I would say the same thing about Greenport as well. In the era of the leading up to the 1930s, the communities were made up of predominantly Jewish immigrants. And while they were very proud of their Jewish practice, they also wanted to fit into the communities in which they lived. And so their building architecture style was very modest, not ostentatious in any way. They didn't want to stand out. But like I said, they did want to have an impact on their community. They were merchants, they were shoemakers and tailors and butchers, and they all relied on the population as a whole in order to grow their own businesses. And they also contributed significantly to the communities in which they lived. Post-World War II, you have some architectural styles in the Greek Revival sort of architecture style. These are all congregations that had existed before the war, and their plans to build a synagogue were put on hold until after the war was over. And then once you get into the 1950s and 1960s, synagogue architecture really starts to change. There's one good reason for this, but you see Percival Goodman is mentioned on this slide. He was pretty much the most prolific synagogue architect of the era of the 50s and 60s. He was the he was the chairman of the architecture department at Columbia University, and he designed over 50 synagogues in the United States and Canada, 10 of them being on Long Island. I just want to mention, there's one quick statistic that kind of shows the growth of Long Island. And I've said many times, post-World War II, the congregations grew. In 1930, there were 6,000 Jews who lived in Nassau County, and they made up 1.9% of the population. 30 years later, in 1960, there were 345,000 Jews living in Nassau County alone, and they made up 26.5% of the population. So you're going from a period in 1930 where Jews are just happy to fit in to a period in 1960 where they're making up 1 out of every 4 people who live in the county. So that not only are Jews feeling better about themselves and their position within society, they're showing that in their architecture style of the buildings that are opening in their communities. So in the left, you see West Hempstead. In the center, you see Freeport, and on the right, Great Neck. The similarities here are, all things that Goodman wanted to bring forward, and they include an arc in the center, which is pretty much for every synagogue, but a very, very high ceiling. And you can see for the arc being a very tall in each of these synagogues, at the top, there is a light source at the top of each of the arcs, and that is meant for the people sitting in the pews to have a feeling of ascension and to feel the power of God. That was Percival Goodman's style and reasoning for that design. Other architects came to prominence during the period. You see this interesting exterior in Hewlett East Rockaway Jewish Center in 1955. In East Meadow in 1957, you have Temple Emmanuel that actually has a sanctuary that's built in the round, which was very groundbreaking for its day, as was the Sinai Reformed Temple in Bayshore. It was also very groundbreaking because if you see the blueprints here, the bird's eye view, you can see that the floor, or the bird's eye view of the sanctuary, was built in the shape of a Star of David. There were similarities in the interior of certain buildings as well. In each of these examples, you notice that there are wood beams that come to a point with wooden slats in between those beams. Imagine if you turned this upside down, you'd be inside of a boat, and therefore you have what's called the Noah's Ark interior of all these buildings post-World War II. In the 1980s, you have wealthy people moving out east, buying second homes, and there is a synagogue that is constructed in East Hampton called the Jewish Center of the Hamptons. It was built in 1988 by Norman Jaffe, and there is if you've ever had the chance to be inside this synagogue building, it is wonderful. It's built of all wood, no metal screws, from what I'm told. Couple of interesting things. You can see all the exterior light, and the ark is set back from the bima, supposedly to be symbolizing a tent in the woods, and a temporary home is what the original, I guess, synagogue design was. In the right upper photo, you see that these beams or these posts are bent, and that is supposed to symbolize individuals in prayer who are bowing down to God. In the lower left, this is the exterior of the building, and it's supposed to hearken the sense and the feeling of the synagogues of Europe. And the lower right, a very unique architecture design, the Star of David cedar shingles on the exterior of the building. You also have other modern synagogues that are being built out east. This one in West Hampton Beach, the Hampton Synagogue, with what I think is probably the most unique mechitza I've ever seen. On the right-hand side, the right-hand photo, you can see these metal posts are sticking up from the ground, and that essentially divides the sanctuary in seating for men and women. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning, the night that I was in Midway, before demolition of the sanctuary, there were 2 questions that I asked myself. What's the oldest synagogue on Long Island? We've established that that was built in Suffolk in 1896. It took me 4 years to photograph every synagogue on Long Island. And the book that has resulted is a fully comprehensive study of every synagogue, past or present, in Nassau and Suffolk County. So, another question for the group. Who wants to take a guess? How many active congregations are there on Long Island today? Don't be shy.
125.
125 is the first guess.
Does that include like the small little Chabad, like shtiebels?
It does.
It does?
Yes. So knowing that, do you think it's more or less than 125?
It's more or less around that number?
Well, somebody guessed 125, and I figured maybe you'd want to take a guess as well.
More.
320.
320, okay?
500.
500, okay. We're getting up there.
Ooh.
Most people usually guess on
200.
200. So 200 is more in the neighborhood. There are 219 congregations that are active on Long Island today, Nassau and Suffolk County only. You see there's 166 in Nassau, 53 in Suffolk, 1 in both, kind of a weird thing, but Temple Chaverim in Plainview, when you walk in the front door, you're in Nassau County, but if you're in their back, it's actually in Suffolk County, which I've spoken with the executive director, and he says when they have, use for the fire department, they have to call the Nassau County or the Plainview Fire Department, but if it's a water issue, they have to call the Suffolk County Water Board. It's kind of a weird thing. And representative of my work is the fact that I photographed 385 buildings on Long Island that still stand, that are being used, that either currently are or at one time were being used as a synagogue. So I just want to show you about a half a dozen more photos. The only reason why I'm sharing these as part of the presentation is a selfish reason. It's because I like these photos. I was a photographer in college, and I haven't really had the chance to utilize my creative abilities much in the last 20 to 30 years. Family, kids get in the way and all that kind of stuff. But this is a photograph of Temple Emmanuel in East Meadow. I mentioned this one before. This was the sanctuary that was built in the round. And the interior of this building is so amazing to see the colors of the hexagonal windows, the stained glass that exists inside the building. But this is really the wall that you see is all the entire wall of the sanctuary. It was made of just 2 elements, concrete and glass. And so being inside the sanctuary, it was very cold in the winter, and I feel very fortunate to have been able to have taken this photograph, my favorite photograph of the interior of any sanctuary. And I'm very pleased to have done it because the fact of the matter is that this building no longer stands. You can see at the very top, you have the 10 Commandments here. At the very top, you could see a little piece of the dome roof of this building was also made of concrete, and it began to crumble. And the congregation couldn't afford the repairs. The congregation ended up merging with another, and the synagogue has been torn down, and the land is now becoming a 55 and over residential community.
Were they able to do anything to salvage the windows?
You mean other than me, who went under the cover of darkness to go steal some of the glass out of the dumpsters on site?
Good answer.
I do understand that the congregation did make mezuzot, and they broke up some of the glass and put them in the mezuzahs, and then I think they also made some diamond necklaces, but they didn't save anything as far as I know. But I have a couple of remnants that are sitting in my garage. This is a congregation Ohav Shalom in Merrick. What I loved about this sanctuary is the Star of David beam at the top. You can see this wood beam that I tried to photograph with a regular camera, but I couldn't get the entire Jewish star in one image. So I had to use a fisheye lens. And just to give you perspective, because it can be a little disorienting, this is the arc down at the lower part. These are the pews down here, and this is the ceiling that runs from here all the way to here. When you're photographing 385 buildings, it was my desire to bring out something unique in each one. So that required going out at different times of day, at sunrise and at sunset, and going out during the different seasons. So this was a photograph that I liked very much. The Sephardic temple in Cedarhurst. This was at sunset in the wintertime. And you can see even the light on the left-hand side coming through the stained glass windows on the inside of that building. And before I had started this project, I had never been inside a Sephardic synagogue. When I visited the Iranian Jewish Center, the president was only too happy to show me around, talk to me about the congregation, what makes it different than a traditional Ashkenazi synagogue. And when he opened up the doors to the Ark and he pulled the curtains on the Ark, this to me was like a treasure chest being opened. The beauty of these Torahs that, as you may know, stand vertically in the Sephardic tradition as opposed to the Ashkenazic tradition. The beauty of each one and the number of them was just very, very mind-boggling to me. So that made for a nice photograph. This is Temple Beth Shalom in Roslyn Heights, a photograph that I took at sunset. And this is another one of those Percival Goodman designed synagogues. You can see the very high ark and the high ceiling inside the sanctuary. And last but not least, this is Midway Jewish Center. This is the finished version of the renovation that was done in our congregation, which I personally love so much. The pews you can see are in the round, surrounding the shulchan where the Torah is read from, and the rabbi has essentially taken the entire service off of the bima. There is really nothing that goes on the bima anymore, other than to go up to the bima to take out the Torahs. It's really more of a symbolic community of being closer together. And the rabbi was instrumental in seeing this design come through. Now, normally I give these presentations in person. I was giving about 15 to 20 presentations before COVID hit. And once COVID hit, I did start doing the presentations through Zoom. When I do that, I try to appeal to people that if you are enjoying the presentation and you are interested in the book, I am happy to work with you to sell you a copy of the book. If you want to jot down my email address, you can email me at kolodnybrad@gmail.com. If you want to check out my website, I've listed the website address as well. The book is a hardcover coffee table book that sells for $48. But when I give presentations, I'm happy to sell it to the group for $40. And if you want to send me an email, if you're interested, happy to take a check or work something out. If any of you use Venmo, we can do it that way. We can use PayPal, and then I can send you the book in the mail. Maybe it's not too late for Hanukkah, the last day being today. It's a great Hanukkah gift, and I probably should have done this before. Let me just show you real quick. This is what the book looks like. As I said, a hardcover coffee table book, which would be great in your homes, or if you wanted to give it as a gift. It's also available on Amazon. You might find it there for $48. And if you buy it through me, as I said, the discount, and I'm happy to sign it as well. I'm going to open it up for questions in a moment, but I just want to share a couple of other things that I've been busy with since COVID started. This first book about the synagogues of Long Island is, as I mentioned, completely comprehensive, covers every single building that has ever existed on Long Island. When COVID started, I began doing some more research and came up with the idea of writing another book, but this one is about the Jewish people of Long Island, when they came, why they came, what were their careers, how did they make money, how did the synagogues and the Jewish community form in each town. And in order to make it fully comprehensive, I was able to do some archival research on census records and whatnot, and I have identified over 4,000 people who lived on Long Island before the end of World War I. So the title of the book, The Jews of Long Island, 1705 to 1918. There is a section or a chapter dedicated to Greenport as one of the very early and important Jewish communities on Long Island. A lot of great names that might still be remembered today. I know that the stained glass windows in your sanctuary, some of them are dedicated to families like the Goldens and the Kaplans, and there are a number of families that have a very long history in your synagogue. I've also established the Jewish Historical Society of Long Island. From the two books, I have met with so many different people and spoken with so many people that I felt there was a need for establishing a place where Jewish history could live, where people could come visit, sort of like to serve as a repository of records. And I've also been accumulating items from different synagogues or individual Jewish businesses. There was a tailor in Greenport in 1910. His descendant, it was the Bush family, and Ron Bush is somebody who lives in Brookhaven, and so he's given me some information about his family in Greenport, and so this is something that's really exciting for me. You can check out our website at jhsli.org. That is the extent of my presentation. So I'm happy to open it up to questions. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope your Lunch and Learn was a good learning experience. And feel free to unmute or raise your hand. I guess I'll stop sharing. It might be easier to see. Thank you for the claps. And
This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
my
I
pleasure.
think,
Sarah, do you want to lead the questions, or do you want me?
Yes, I will do that. I think I saw
know
Liz,
people better than
excuse me, I want to thank you, Brad, for a wonderful presentation. You bring so much personality into your remarks. They really make it wonderfully interesting, and I thank you for that. I think the first hand that I saw raised was Liz Adams. So Liz, you have a question for Brad?
Well, I have two comments. Number one, I saw your exhibit at the Riverhead Historical Society, and I bought the book.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it very much. My question is, in the early days, why did so many more Jews settle in Suffolk rather than Nassau?
Great question. Not only did the Jews settle in Suffolk, but if you look at it, they settled very much along the South Shore and the North Shore along the water. There were villages that had been established out in Suffolk County in the 17th century, the 18th century, and the early 19th century. And when Jews were moving out, they basically went to the villages where there was already somewhat of a population. So when you're talking about Greenport and Sag Harbor and Patchogue and even Setauket to an extent, these are villages that had already existed, but the Jews came out for all different reasons. There were Jews who came out because they were peddlers and they were selling goods from town to town, but there were also some that came out to work in a factory like Setauket, as I mentioned, like Patchogue, which had a lace mill, like Sag Harbor, which had a watch case factory. When I mention Greenport to people, a lot of people assume that there were Jewish whalers, or, there were some Jews who worked in, maybe like oystering, but not too many. And, I think it was just a village where people came to set up shop, and there were Jews in Greenport as early as the 1870s. So everybody came out for different reasons, but I think the primary factor was because of work. And maybe you asked why Suffolk as opposed to Nassau. Nassau County itself didn't come into existence until 1899. All the land up until the border of Nassau and Suffolk was Queens. And there really wasn't much activity. I mean, you had, you had Freeport, you had the village of Glen Cove, you had the Hempstead, and there were certain villages that did exist, but there wasn't as much. So it was almost like a big gap between the city and Suffolk County. Suffolk County definitely outpaced the area that is Nassau County in population for, probably up until after World War I.
Thank you.
Good. Rabbi Gotti has a question.
Yeah, first of all, I enjoyed this presentation
Thank
so
you.
much. We can continue until dinner and learn. I wanted to ask if we wanted to maybe do a physical tour of those synagogues. Let's say pick an area, read a part of Suffolk County or Nassau County, and actually do a walkthrough. Would you do you do that stuff?
It's a great
Lead a
question.
tour like that?
It's not the first time I've been asked that question. And I did try to put together somewhat of a tour, but it hasn't panned out. I think because, the question that I got to do this was during COVID, did you want to do something outside? And could you lead people from place to place? I think in Nassau County and even in Western Suffolk, that's a little bit tricky because there are synagogues of significance that are, I think, too spread out. So it could end up being like a 3 or 4 hour day. I'm not sure if people are into that. Maybe they are. And hey, if you wanted to come up with something, maybe that's something that we can arrange in your area, because certainly East Hampton and Sag Harbor and West Hampton Beach, some of these are within a fair proximity of each other. But I think there are also a lot of logistics in terms of maybe arranging with the synagogue to go inside. And so I haven't done that yet, but it is a very good idea. And I appreciate what you say about how much we could learn. And it's just amazing to me that up until the time I started to do this, nobody had really been keeping track of the history of Judaism on Long Island. There was a woman in the 1970s and 1980s who documented some of the earliest Jews by doing audio recordings. Her name was Helene. Why am I drawing a blank on her last name? She lived in Eastport, and she did audio recordings but not really that much else. Helene Gerard. I don't know if any of you know her name. Her husband, Lloyd Gerard, ran an antique store up until a couple of years ago in Eastport. In any case, there has not been a full study of Judaism on Long Island. And so as I was doing initial research, I couldn't believe that it was so hard to find details on this history. So I had to go to original sources, census records, naturalization papers, newspapers, advertisements for Jewish-owned businesses were fantastic, and just so much information is out there and available when you're searching online that I hope that the learning continues beyond this into my second book, and who knows, maybe there'll be a second presentation that I do for that book.
I've already taken some notes on that, Brad. Alan had a question.
Yeah, Brad, do you know Ira Polakoff?
I do.
Okay, he wrote a book called Synagogues of Long Island. He
Yeah.
actually came about 5 or 6 years ago and did a presentation at our synagogue. So I don't know how comprehensive that book was, but that was an attempt as well.
Yeah. So there is a little bit of a backstory there, and I'll share with you. First of all, Ira is deceased. For whatever reason, I mentioned that first, I'm not sure, but he's no longer with us. Ira and I began together doing one project and doing one book. And the book that you held up, you'll notice is in black and white, with the exception of the front and the back cover. He was doing research on the buildings and doing the written part, and I was doing the photography. And it was absolutely essential for me to do a book in color with photographs that could show off the work that I've done. And without getting into too much detail, he was able to get a deal with a publisher, the publisher that you see, Arcade Press, and they publish these books that are history books that are in black and white, essentially. And that didn't work for me. So we parted ways. He did his book, and you know, I won't say anything more about his book, but I certainly prefer mine and think that it is, like, I know that it is more comprehensive than his. It's just, I think it's just a different idea of what could be done, and we went different ways.
I think it's probably a very good idea that we have both books as references and guides to the synagogues on Long Island. And I'm sure that the black and white book contains certain information. And of course, the photography from your book is so magnificent.
Thank you.
So I think both are certainly valuable to have. I think that Adrian, did you have a question, Adrian? Did I see your hand up? I'm sorry. Are there other people who have some questions? Rena has a question.
Yeah, what was the population of our synagogue way back when?
So it was always modest. You know, it was never a huge congregation. I think when it started, you know, there were, well, let's see, I'll tell you one interesting note. In my research, I found at the Long Island Museum in Stony Brook, they have, I don't know how they got it from you guys, but they have a register of membership from Congregation Tifereth Israel in Greenport from 1915. And it shows the names of the individuals and the dues that they paid. 50 cents a month, $6 for the entire year. This was
Wow.
And they were penalized if you didn't show up for minyan.
From 1 second. Oh my God, someone's banging on my door.
So, yeah, the
Green State
congregation,
that.
I think the congregation has always been fairly modest in size.
How big was the congregation then?
There were maybe 15 families, and you know,
That's it? Wow.
at the time, you know, when it was founded, you know, it was just men, right? They were the names of in the register are the men's names. The women were not listed, but you know, because you had the
Mechitza. Yeah.
that women and men both attended synagogue.
Anyone else? Paul has a question.
I have two, but I'll start with one. So when did the congregation build the sanctuary, or was it donated? Because it really is the size of a house.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious if it was donated or built that way.
It was definitely built by the congregation. And I believe in the book, if I'm not mistaken, I have the name of the architect as well as the builder. So there was nothing. They bought the lot of land on 4th Street, and they built the synagogue. It was not a house that was donated, but it was built. Going back to, you know, the part where I spoke about architecture, a very plain, you know, sort of A-frame building that did not stand out. If you were walking along the street, you wouldn't know that it was a Jewish house of worship.
And my second question is, you mentioned the Moorish architecture. When did that? How did that come into being? The synagogue I went to in New Jersey, in New Brunswick, when I was a kid, was the Moorish Renaissance. You said Renaissance.
Moorish revival.
Moorish Renaissance architecture. How did that become a Jewish architecture?
You know, it's just a style, and you have, you know, the Greek style, I guess the Moorish style, and you have some other architectural styles that are prominent, and I guess they're, you know, chosen depending on who the architect is and what their vision for the building is. You know, that's the photograph I used on the cover, as you can see also from you know, what was up on the screen. It was built in Lynbrook, and it was from 1929. So I imagine that your synagogue in New Brunswick was probably in a similar era. I wouldn't think that it was a post-World War II synagogue if it was Moorish revival architecture.
Interesting.
Okay, thank you. Carol Siegel had a question.
And I have a good, first, where the Kane Street Synagogue in Brooklyn, where my kids belonged, and I think it's a Moorish revival. It's a large synagogue, but I believe it was originally built earlier on as a church and then converted into a synagogue, as far as I know. But I think it's the same style from way back, but in a much larger scale. And I was always curious about the architecture there, but I think its origin was as a church of some kind, and it was taken over early on as a synagogue. So
Yeah,
I
I'm
was just
not
adding,
familiar.
yeah.
I know about the building.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was originally a church or not.
Yeah, well, that's the story that, that circulates, right? But
Right.
early on, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, are there other questions? We're running a bit over. Barbara Ann, you have a question? Barbara Ann? Yes? Maybe not. You are muted, I guess. You're muted, Barbara Ann.
I'm unmuted now. Do you mention in your book Temple Israel of Riverhead?
Of course. The book is fully comprehensive. Every single synagogue that's ever existed on Long Island. Temple Israel in Riverhead is also an early one. It was
Yes, it
formed in
is.
about 1911, the congregation, and they built a synagogue in 1924. The building still stands, but it's no longer used as the synagogue. Their synagogue on Northville Turnpike opened in 1947.
They did at 47 because my mother grew up at Temple.
Nice.
Okay, thank you, Barbara Ann.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions before we adjourn? Now Adrian does have a question.
Brad, is the Historical Society in Riverhead still showing the synagogue exhibit?
They are,
Yes.
and that's also another great little success story that I had made the arrangement with the executive director there for the exhibit to run from August through October, in conjunction with the 125th anniversary of the synagogue in Suffolk, which was celebrated in September. She said that they got such wonderful response, which I was so happy to hear, that groups were coming from all over, synagogue groups, Hadassah groups, and they got a number of phone calls at the end of October to say, I haven't been able to get out there yet. How can I see it? Where is it going to be next? And so she asked me if I would keep it open. The exhibit will be running through the end of the year. So you can still see it in the month of December. If you haven't been out there, it's 18 photographs that I chose from the book that tell the story of the progression of Jewish history. So you have a photograph of a number of different, 18 different buildings that are significant for one reason or another.
Okay. Well, I think all of our questions have been answered. And Brad, I do want to thank you again for this delightful presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My
Thank you.
pleasure. Glad to be here with you all today. Happy Hanukkah.